I've got a client down in Mobile, Alabama, and she has a deep religious belief about her, and she's widowed, and I was talking with her, and she was speaking about how God played an important role in her life. And so I knew this was important to her. And, after they hung up the phone, I said, geez, I think it would be really nice if we mailed her a journal, just a journal that was spiritual based. I mean, it was a $15 investment. I sent it to her. You think I gave her the world. I mean, I got a handwritten note back that would make any grown man come to tears. So it's just little things like that. They're really trying to escalate and show people that we care.
Welcome, Model FAs. David DeSell here, president of Model FA and your host of the Model FA podcast. And it is my pleasure to bring our guest to you today, Mark Colgan. So Mark and I have been working together for close to a year. I've been able to get the opportunity to take a deep dive into his business and help him with some of the things that he has going on. But I am very excited to learn more about his backstory, kind of how he got into the business. And then one of the particular niches that he does focus on, to the extent where he even wrote a book for that, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But Mark's been a financial planner for 29 years and is obsessed with helping clients prepare for the worst, then focus entirely on how to orchestrate a financial plan that helps them live a fulfilled life. He believes that money is nothing more than the freedom to say yes to more in life because we can't take it with us when we go. His daughter says, based on his age, too old to say YOLO, but he figures when he gets one shot at this experience on Earth, why not embrace the adventure? And we can talk a bit about the catalyst that inspired his way of thinking and planning. But without further ado, Mark, appreciate you joining and apologize for the age joke to kick us off.
Hey, that's okay. I like to go with the flow. And David, I'm really happy to be here. I love the podcast and listening to you just talk through conversationally with a lot of different experts, bringing a lot of different perspectives. So I'm flattered to be here.
I appreciate it. Yeah, it's fun. I get to meet a lot of great people, honestly get to build a lot of great relationships. Some of these folks, obviously we were working together, before we scheduled this, but some of these folks I never would have had the opportunity to connect with. So the podcast is a great platform to provide some value and meet some great people. And you never know kind of where those relationships will go in the future. So 29 years in the business. You started in the business when I was 2 or 3 years old, Mark. So help me understand, did you do something before you got into this career? Did you kind of get into this space right away? Like, how'd you get started in business in general?
That's a great question. So I was at RIT and I did an internship with Edward Jones and Company, and I worked there for 6 months. And at that point in time, it was interesting. I mean, the computers were so dated that the advisor had me opening up annual reports that he had, delivered to the office by the dozen. And he had me analyzing the profit and loss statements from all these different companies and inputting the data so he could decide whether he should buy, sell, or hold the stock. So that's where I started in the industry. And, shortly after I graduated, I got thinking about what I wanted to do. And I contacted Edward Jones, and then that's where it all started.
And how long were you at EJ for?
7 years.
And within that 7-year period, or I guess towards the end of that 7-year period, what sort of caused you to go in a different direction? Because obviously you're not there anymore. So did you go from Edward Jones to then starting your own shop right away, or was there an in-between step?
That's a good question. There was a lot of transition in that 7 years. I will say that Edward Jones was probably the best possible experience I could have had at that point in time because their training was remarkable. They gave you a quote recipe that they called it to follow. And as long as you had grit and determination and you followed the recipe, you would most likely succeed. And that's what happened. I started by understanding how to really communicate with people in a way that was engaging and welcoming. And I knocked on 4,000 houses in my community. It's like an out of body experience to me. I can't believe it was me that did that. But yeah, I knocked on 4,000 doors and I met lots of wonderful people, many of which are still clients today. And so I had that wonderful foundation of understanding how to build an authentic relationship with people. And it was a wonderful firm to work with. But towards the end of the 7 years, I had gotten my CFP designation. And my vision was, hey, I feel like this whole industry is going to be centered around the value behind financial planning. And they literally said to me, well, that's nice. And we really don't have the capability to monitor that. So we don't want you getting into financial planning. In fact, we do not authorize you to put the CFP designation on your business card. And I'm like, wow, right? And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I'm not just going to be peddling American funds for the rest of my life. They were an honorable, ethical firm without a doubt, but it was just a belief set that was a disconnect. So even though I was a partner at the time, even because I was so successful there, I decided to break ties and switch firms.
Well, it's interesting because I have a similar viewpoint. Ironically, you spent 7 years at Edward Jones. I spent 7 years at Northwestern. And as much as we believe that they can be doing things different and perhaps better in terms of the products and service that they do deliver, it's cool that we both appreciate, given all that stuff that we disagree on with what they do, that we both appreciate the training that was involved, because it really does, teach you the basics of relationship building and, grit and perseverance. I wouldn't have had, the cojones to be knocking on doors. I'm actually curious with the knocking on doors. I'm sure out of all the pleasant experiences you've had and the relationships that you built from that, there's probably one or two not so pleasurable experience that maybe still sticks in your mind today. I'm curious to know if you remember those and can share, like, what was the worst experience in knocking on the door?
You'd be surprised how welcoming and friendly people were, but you definitely had those curmudgeons that, they'll even have a sign on the door, no soliciting. And Edward Jones' point was, you're not soliciting, knock anyway, even if you see one of those signs. So you know that you're kind of setting yourself up for some challenge. And so I'd rap on the door. Specifically, you had to knock. You're never supposed to ring the doorbell because strangers ring doorbells, neighbors knock. Just all these little nuances.
Interesting.
All these little nuances. When you stood in front of them, you would have to stand at a slight angle, because if you're facing them, that can be kind of an attack mode, offensive, put them on the defense. So anyway, through all these strategies, even those folks, what would happen with that gentleman was you could just see the anger in his voice. He pulled the shade back and pointed at the screen and flipped me the bird. So I'm like, okay, I don't see this becoming a client of mine, so I'll just gracefully walk away.
There's like that scenario, because basically, he told you to pound sand, and that scenario can happen whether if you're cold calling or if you get a referral from a client and perhaps the client didn't let them know that you'd be in touch, and maybe that's not well received, or even someone that you bring through the process that ultimately doesn't choose to work with you. It's all similar-ish in nature. So like in that moment, when that type of stuff happened, like what got you to just walk to the next house and not just call it a day? Like, how did you kind of persevere through the rejection side of the business? Because especially early on, as we're trying to get established, there's a ton of rejection, and maybe even there's still plenty of rejection as we mature through our business, but it doesn't feel as painful because we actually have a business at that point and have revenue. So it's like, cool, on to the next one. But when every person you come across is so important to, quite frankly, just kind of pay your bills, that can really sting. So how'd you work through that?
I got to clear a couple cobwebs to think back that far, but I suspect the drive to succeed, and this is the fact that I knew it was a numbers game. At the end of the day, you're going to talk to, perhaps, let's say 20, 25 houses. You might talk to those folks. And it's a numbers game. They literally could scientifically tell you if you do this many for this period of time, this is how many accounts you're going to open. So I just hook, line, and sinker. I believed everything they told me. I didn't have any reason not to believe in what they told me. And I was determined to succeed. My first hurdle was to get 50 clients, and then they would give me an office. So for the first 6 months or so, I literally was knocking on doors with a PO box on my business card. So I'd hand them a business card, and a couple of people looked at me and they're like, "Are you kidding me? You want me to invest with you? I don't know you. You don't have an office, and it's a PO box." So talk about, I mean, a lot of this business is esoteric and difficult to, you don't have a tangible product. To do it with a PO box was, definitely, I figured if I can get through this, I can get through any sales call.
That's cool. So let's fast forward to today. So what's your current business look like? How many households are you serving? What AUM are you in charge of? What does your staff look like in its current state? Like, help people understand how you went from door knocking, or a context where you started with door knocking, to where you are today.
Okay, sure. So I'll tell you that I did leave. I went to a firm based out of Cleveland called McDonald Investments. No jokes, please. I had heard enough of those as I was, and they were much more financial planning based. It was really nice. I was there for 4 years. The short version is I left because when KeyBank bought them, it just was not. It was oil and water, and the whole firm just kind of unraveled. So it was at the end of those 4 years, I said, that's it, I'm done. I need to go independent and control my own fate and establish my own culture. So it was in 2004 that I established myself as an independent financial advisor. Best decision I ever made for me. It's not right for everybody, right? But for me, it worked out really well. And then fast forward through to today to answer your question. So today, David, I've got, as of today, $210 million under management and about 340 households. And it will change in a short term here. I've got a small acquisition coming up in a couple of months that'll take me probably to a little over 250 million. And at that point, I'll be, I don't know, maybe 380 households. But nonetheless, in anticipation of that growth, I've got a reasonable staff. I've got myself, I've got 2 service financial advisors, and then I've got 3 support staff.
Now, how did an excellent work over the years? I mean, 250 million in AUM is no joke. And what's cool about it too is not only, are you creating a great lifestyle for yourself and obviously serving your clients, but you're able to put food on the table for a handful of other individuals on your team, which probably feels really good to do. How did because I would imagine that you're not knocking on doors anymore. No. So how has your business development strategies or tactics, if you will, how have those changed over the years? So you went from knocking on doors. What's kind of driven the most business to you? Is it COIs, client referrals? Are you doing any other sort of like marketing that's been working well? How did you get from starting your business, knocking on doors, to boom, 200 something million in AUM?
It would be 2 things: client referrals from those that are satisfied. I've got a friend of mine, Stephen Werging, who does some coaching as well. And he always said the best way to get referrals is to overly impress your existing clients so that they start bragging about you. And so I've always had this huge drive to deliver great service. And I know that, a lot of people in our industry do a very good job at that, but I try so hard to take it to the next level and do little special things. Like, for instance, quick tangent, I've got a client down in Mobile, Alabama, and she has a deep religious belief about her, and she's widowed. And I was talking with her, and she was speaking about how God played an important role in her life. And so I knew this was important to her. And, after they hung up the phone, I said, geez, I think it would be really nice if we mailed her a journal, just a journal that was spiritual based. I mean, it was a $15 investment. I sent it to her. You think I gave her the world? I mean, I got a handwritten note back that would make any grown man come to tears. So it's just little things like that. They're really trying to escalate and show people that we care. The other reason that I've gotten to where I've gotten beyond the personal service and level is that I've had some acquisitions along the way where I've been fortunate enough to meet some other financial advisors that were older than me, and through an established relationship of trust, they decided that they would turn over their business to me, of course, in exchange for a pretty penny too. But I've had 3 acquisitions. I've got another one this year, and I've got another one planned after that. I do wonder if at some point I'm going to call it quits on the acquisitions, but nonetheless, that's been a fruitful part of the growth.
I'm glad you shared the example, and kind of how I word it is advancing, the relationship with the folks that you serve and sending out that journal, because I share with folks all the time that you cannot expect to get an introduction because you do a stellar job with their financial plan. Certainly that may happen, but you can't necessarily expect that, because all you're really doing by delivering a great financial plan is you're meeting the client's expectations. Like, they're paying you, they would expect that you're going to give them the best. But when you over rotate into relational deposits, advancing the relationship along, and really showing the client that you care about them as a human, as opposed to just being your client, it kind of makes them feel like they're special, and it feels like they have a great experience. And people don't talk to other folks because their expectations were met. So sorry, I can't help myself, but going back to the McDonald's example with the firm that you used to work at.
Yeah.
So like, if I go to McDonald's and I order a Big Mac and ask for no onions, and I get my Big Mac and it has no onions on it. First of all, I'm not going to tell people about that because I don't want them knowing I was at McDonald's, but also because it's not worth talking about. They met my expectations. But when you go to that high-end steakhouse and they pull you and your date's chair out for you to sit, they fold the napkin on your lap and they scrape the crumbs off, and the chef comes out to make sure everything's cooked great. Like, that's an experience that's worth talking about. So by moving the relationship along, sending a journal, sharing a resource, giving them a call out of the blue, all that stuff helps elevate the experience to where they're more likely to send you an introduction and make them feel really good. Like you said, that handwritten note sounds like she poured her heart into that, which is really cool. And I think you mentioned when you were going through that piece, Mark, did I hear you correctly that she had been recently widowed?
Yeah, I mean, it probably had been a year since that transpired. So it wasn't really recent, no.
Okay, but recent within the last year or so when you had done that, which kind of segues well into the next point. So oftentimes I talk to advisors about the importance of picking a niche or 2 niches that to really go deep on and focus on. Not only does it help with your marketing and collateral and things like that, but it also helps with your service model to position it in such a way that's actually scalable. And you have been really focused on the niche to the extent that you've written a book about it, which we'll talk about shortly, in helping widowed folks help navigate their next steps, not just financially, but kind of in their life as well. So my first question is, why are you passionate about that? What is it that kind of drove you to wanting to spend kind of time, effort, and resources on serving those folks in particular?
I've been through it myself. Unfortunately, David, my story goes back a week before 9/11. I had, I was home with my wife and I woke up early to work out in the gym, and the alarm went off and I kind of grunted, I got to go work out. Gave her a routine morning kiss. I went down into the basement to work out. And when I came back upstairs, I had found Joanne, my wife of 7 years, passed away. It was clear from some certain descriptions that I'll hold back, but that morning was insanity. I went from waking up with her and giving her a routine morning kiss to within hours, I called 911. I was desperately trying to save her life doing CPR. The room was almost instantly, it seemed, full of EMTs, policemen, firemen. People were just throwing furniture. The bed was just shoved off to the side. They were running in to try to save her. And that was how my morning started. And the hours and days and weeks that followed that were, to me, earth shattering. And, at the time I was even a CFP, but way, way back then, because I got my CFP a while ago. And I just, in the midst of all of that, even knowing everything I know about financial planning and, big deal CFP, you can't really apply a lot of that because you're just so emotionally distraught. And so that was the genesis of where this whole thing started, of having an incredible compassion for people that are in that situation and trying to do whatever I can to help.
Like I said at the beginning, we've been working together for almost a year or so now. And, I was aware that it was kind of that experience or that you've had that experience, but not to that detail. So I appreciate you kind of going back in your memory and sharing that. And you can, unfortunately, you have a really good story to be able to empathize with the folks that are going through that scenario to where you know what it's like. So I guess in that scenario, when someone's in the midst of working through that, what are the things that happen specifically from a financial standpoint where, like, I would imagine there's, depending on, the spouse that passes away, if they were in charge of the finances, like that can be a shit show.
Yeah.
So like, let's say someone's spouse suddenly passes away. How do you come in and help them in a way that's maybe different than the average person who's, happy-go-lucky walking around looking to save for retirement?
Well, some of this depends on the situation, of course, but I'll try to keep it simple and maybe just give you two examples. One might be you have, unfortunately, all too many people really don't do the estate planning that they should, or even if they do, they did a generic will so long ago that it just doesn't have a lot of detail. And so in those scenarios where there is very little discussions had about estate planning and last wishes, et cetera, there is an exponential amount of mystery that has to be dealt with at that moment that I meet with them. And then there's others that perhaps were more thoughtful about their estate plan. They had a financial advisor or an attorney that really guided them through some thoughtful discussions, and they documented a lot of that. And, in that scenario, it's a lot more of a relaxed, less stressful situation to deal with. But that aside, to get to your point, when they're coming in, it is, first of all, recognizing the situation they're in, always using the name of the deceased when I speak to them. A lot of people feel that, geez, don't mention Joe's name because Betty's going to unravel if you even bring it up. Well, not necessarily. I would go as far as saying to specifically say his name several times in that meeting. I may reference, hopefully Joe and the memories you had with him will remain, forever. I just want to share with you a couple of things that I remember about Joe was that, he always had this quirky smile and he just, whatever, some characteristics that are endearing, then you reference those. And there's a sincere, of course, acknowledgement of that person in the situation. We're not dancing around it. So that really establishes some level of respect and understanding, maybe even compassion. But then you do get into, of course, the nuts and bolts of things. And if you're talking with them after all this funeral arrangements and everything have been taken care of, perhaps one of the first things is to talk about is just cash flow. It's one of the largest concerns that widows and widowers both have is just, okay, now we've got this avalanche of new and different expenses and where the money's coming from. And of course, to your point, if they weren't the money manager of the house, then it's even more of a delicate topic.
Hey, Model FAs. I know you're enjoying this conversation, but I wanted to take a quick break to talk to you about the Model FA Accelerator. This is a unique collaboration between us and you, where we help you build a financial advising practice that you can be proud of. We focus on the foundational concepts around how to pick a niche or a specialization, how to price your services, how to construct an offer that people are going to buy, and then how to market it and sell it in a way that'll get people to sign on the dotted line and become clients of your firm, all while giving you the information to scale and set up workflows and operational processes that will allow you to reclaim your time and build a practice that doesn't run you. So if you'd like to hear more about that, go to www.modelfa.com/accelerator or www.modelfa.com. Hover over, work with us, and click on Accelerator. Hope to see you in the program.
So in that scenario, obviously there's the emotional side of course, grieving. There is the logistical side of, putting together the services. What have you found is kind of the most appropriate time for them to have a conversation regarding finances and next steps? Do you kind of do that while that other stuff is going on? Or is it after the fact? Is it, hey, we should probably meet within a month of that? Like, is there any sort of rhyme or reason, or is it just kind of when they're ready? And I ask because sometimes people grieve longer than others, but the financial, landmine, so to speak, that if not addressed, can blow up. Those don't necessarily care about the grieving time. Like, they're going to blow up whenever they're set to blow up if they're not addressed. So like, when should someone plan to meet with an advisor upon this situation happening?
I would say that you should have a week after the funeral services to just not even reach out to them. I mean, every situation could be different, but that would be a rule of thumb to go with is, they pass away on the 1st of the month. They have the services on the 5th of the month. And then you may wait until maybe the 12th before you reach out to them. And then, of course, when you do reach out to them, it is giving them some sense of control. Say, I don't know that you're ready to talk about this, but I want to let you know that I'm here. That said, although I do not want to rush you, there are certain things that we should take care of in the next few weeks. So when you have the opportunity, I'd like to schedule an appointment. It's that type of conversation to help them understand that you respect where they're coming from, but there's a business to be run, right? There's things that have to be done, whether they like it or not. So it's walking that fine line. And the one thing I always encourage is please make sure that you bring a confidant with you to that meeting and all of the meetings that we have. It doesn't necessarily have to be a relative or a friend or whomever, but someone that can be there beside you to absorb all of the things we're talking about, to take notes and to be your advocate. Because I know that if I'm just talking to the widower person, it's just like pouring 18 ounces of coffee into a 12-ounce cup. It's just going to overflow and it's not going to settle.
Do you provide a different, and maybe the answer is no, but do you provide like a different experience or vibe, if you will, when, say, a widow or widower comes in, a week or two after the services are complete, they come into your office? Is there anything that you do differently from an experience standpoint for them that maybe you don't do for other clients, just given the sensitivity of where the emotions are?
I don't think so. I mean, my office environment is very warm and welcoming as it is. And so, no, there's the debate about perhaps bringing out a box of Kleenex to have that handy and that type of thing. But no, I don't do anything different from that standpoint. Although I will say the way in which you communicate is important. And there's Amy Florian is a woman who has written a book called No Longer Awkward. And she does a wonderful job in communicating with financial advisors about things you should or shouldn't say about when you're working with someone in this specific scenario. She's got a very niche consulting practice talking about that. Frankly, I don't agree with everything she says, but I do agree with about 80% of it. And I think it's a very good resource for your listeners to consider learning about. And it's something I've talked about with my staff, things of how to behave or how to communicate with people.
Awesome. Yeah. And we'll make sure that that's linked in the show notes as well to make it easy for you guys to check that out. Speaking of books, you have a book here that you are kind enough to send my way, which I appreciate. It was just recently released called Death's Red Tape, Your Guide for Navigating Legal, Financial, and Personal Transitions When a Partner Dies. Tell me more about this book. What was the inspiration to actually go ahead and write it? I know you've been working on it for quite some time, so it's cool to actually be holding it right now, and nice hardcover, well designed. What was the inspiration behind writing this?
Because the experience I went through with my wife, Joanne, dying suddenly, obviously was a wake-up call for just about anyone, but it really brought to my attention that as smart as we are as financial planners, I think that the topic of death is still a mystery for a lot of people. Maybe it's because it's just an uncomfortable topic for people to address, or maybe it's because a lot of us haven't been through it yet. But for whatever reason, I felt that there was an opportunity to deliver better ways of not just servicing your clients, but the book specifically, it speaks directly to the widower or widower in helping them kind of guide them through that process. So it's my way of making lemonade out of lemons, right? I had that tough life experience, but I learned a lot from it. I took a lot of notes as I went through it because as a diligent financial planner, I thought to myself, geez, if I'm having a hard time with this, I can't imagine someone who's not trained in this industry, what they're going through. So as I took all these notes over the years, I said to myself, I think I really should formalize this into something that's a deliverable that others can benefit from. And that's the whole purpose of the book really is to help, whether it's other financial advisors help their clients, or whether it's helping attorneys help their clients, or just helping the clients directly. I'm hoping that this book is positioned such that they can avoid some of the missteps or uncover some opportunities that they hadn't even known about.
Now, earlier in our conversation before we hit the record button and got all, official, you had mentioned that there's certain things that you see that either people should be looking out for when they find themselves in this situation, or common mistakes that you see people make, when something like this happens. What are some of those things that, folks need to look out for? Because a lot of folks listening to the show have had clients who have passed, but a lot of them have not. So we can theorize, all we want, but until they're actually in that situation trying to help a client, they don't necessarily know exactly what that is like. So I'm curious to know from both the client and the advisor's kind of perspective, what are things that they need to have top of mind to look out for to increase the likelihood that they'll be successful financially moving forward? Like, what are some of those common mistakes?
There are little things that could turn into big things, or they may not. But for instance, I feel as though because grief is this uncomfortable zone of life, people feel that they can get through it by checking things off the list quickly as possible. And so, for instance, I will say, please, but between the time now and by the time we meet, don't pay any debts, don't pay any credit card bills, don't pay any invoices. Everybody, all the debtors can just wait. They can wait. Let's not rush that. And reason being specifically for that is some of these bills aren't their responsibility. I mean, we could go down a whole path of talking about should it be paid ethically or not, but just from the raw facts of it, it could be that the estate is responsible, not the surviving spouse or partner. So maybe there's a $29,000 Visa bill, and if it's in the deceased name, well, that's not your problem, if I'm going to be blunt. So you may choose to pay it off ethically or for whatever reason, but you don't have to. And that has to come out of the estate first. So little things like that, where they're innocently just, let me just get some of these easy things taken care of. Oh, and you know what? I'm going to change. There's another one is I'm going to change this joint account to a single account. And, I'm going to change the registration on all my accounts. I'm like, whoa, slow down, because now you're re-registering assets that are titled in joint name to single name. That could derail your estate plan. Like, we haven't even looked at the estate plan yet. And, there could be all kinds of strategies built into your, whether it's a testamentary trust or any of these strategies that you could potentially, mess up basically if you just start going through and checking these things off. So there are little things that seem innocent that could have repercussions.
Yeah, it's people can be in sort of that emotional state and be impulsive, if you will, with good intentions, of course. But what I'm hearing is grieve, of course. You're going to do the services, and then really your next step is to collaborate with your advisor, perhaps CPA, and of course attorney as well, and just make sure that you're going about it the right way. And then last thing on your book before we start to wrap up and close out today, one of the things that I really liked about it when you were telling me about it, and I want to share this with folks who are on the call or on the podcast, is even though it's written by you, right? And it says certified financial planner right underneath, this isn't a long-winded advertisement for your service. It's truly meant to deliver value to the person who is going through that experience. Mm-hmm. And what I really like about it is if you're an advisor listening to this, you can pick this book up and use it as a way to help someone who's maybe going into or going through that scenario, and use it as a way to help them understand what to focus on. So for those of you who are listening that may find this conversation and scenario to be awkward, perhaps that book can serve as a way to help them out, even if you are slightly uncomfortable with kind of having that conversation. But Mark, I do want to go back slightly, because there must be, other things to look out for. I know a kind of a hot topic is even like identity theft and, things like that. So like, how should folks be kind of protecting themselves from, because there's people out there, unfortunately, that will wait for the obituaries to come out and then, go on attack mode and do everything they can to kind of scam the surviving spouse. So do you see any of that stuff happening?
I do. It's just even terrible to think that this does happen in our world, but absolutely, the survivors can be big targets. I've got a whole list of examples on what should be done to help minimize identity theft. Some examples might include making sure that you send death certificates to the credit reporting agencies so they're aware that this person is deceased, so that nobody can open up credit cards in his or her name. Reporting the death to the Social Security Administration and the DMV. Those are other areas where the identity theft folks will try to maneuver and get things opened up or accounts in different names. I would maybe, depending on the situation, I might even get the fraud protection, some of those services that monitor your credit for the first 12 months. So it's a couple $100. It's probably not a bad investment. Do you need it for the rest of your life? Maybe not, but in this vulnerable stage of life, it may not be a bad investment. Even little things like making sure that you use a crisscross shredder when you're shredding documents, and, changing passwords on some of your financial accounts, things of that nature. It's easy to do. It doesn't really cost you anything or very little, and it can dissuade the risk of identity theft considerably.
Awesome. Anything else before we start to wrap up that folks that find themselves in this situation should look out for or consider?
There's a ton to talk about. One other interesting one, though, I'll just throw in is the idea of the car lease. A lot of people lease cars, and they, once again, trying to get it off their checklist, they turn it in without stopping to think about whether or not that leasor has a death clause. In many cases, not many, but I would say maybe half of the cases, there is in fine print the option to turn in the lease without any future payments that are required. And the funny thing is, the dealers don't even know it exists. So if you can have someone go through that with you, I believe Cadillac is an example where, hey, your spouse dies, turn in the car, give us the keys, we're out. They're good with it. It's a nice thing. Oh, and one more thing real quick. I know we're running short on time, but I can't resist. Chase Bank has this wonderful option that if your spouse was in the military and served, then there is a program where you could get the debt of the mortgage completely relieved.
No way.
Yeah. Yeah. Jamie Dimon has a soft spot in his heart for that. He's always stood behind it. I think there's some specifics that are, that are detailed in how to qualify for that, but you could have the entire mortgage just wiped off as a favor from JP Morgan or as a thank you.
I wonder if USAA does that.
I couldn't tell you. I don't know, but I know that JP Morgan Bank is known for that.
Awesome. Well, Mark, this has been fantastic. Before we do wrap up, however, a couple other things I want to go through. So one of the things that we ask all of our guests is what one of their favorite books is. And we do so to try and distill a reading list because we're bringing on top-notch people and we want to know what those top-notch folks are consuming. I got a little chuckle, however, when you submitted your response. So I'm curious to see kind of the direction that you take it. But you actually submitted a movie, and the movie is The Gladiator. So I'm curious to know kind of why you chose that, the impact that it's had on you. And I know in conversation, you also mentioned Dale Carnegie as an author that you enjoy as well. So feel free to weave that in to your response.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People is so popular that it's not anything surprising to hear from the listeners that that's a foundational book that I think is timeless in its treasures and ideas on how to authentically communicate with people in an effective way. I mean, that is, that's just one of my core books that I'll read over and over. But I also love the movie Gladiator. And some people may stop and say, well, gosh, that's a pretty gory, that's a pretty gory movie. Like, what is it, Mark? Well, it's Russell Crowe, and that the whole performance behind that is he's such an honorable soul. He's a noble man. He's honorable. And the actions throughout the movie, you may not agree with, but if you look at the motivation and the sincerity behind what he's doing and how supportive he is of his family, I think it's an amazing performance. And I think he's an honorable role, and that to me is inspiring.
Love it. If someone who's listening wants to kind of follow along and kind of see what you're up to, or if they want to scoop up the book to read for themselves and perhaps share with their clients, where do you want to send them?
Yeah, they can go to, I've got a couple different websites. My wealth management firm is Montage Wealth Management.com. That's MONTAGE. And so you can catch me there. Or I have mywisdomwill.com, which is deliverable. We can talk about on another podcast, but it's a kind of an estate planning tool that I can make available for folks as well to help in the estate planning process.
Awesome. And is the book linked on that website, or they find that somewhere else?
I would say, David, the easiest thing is just good old Amazon. It's available in every format you can imagine. I think it's an Apple bookstore. It's pretty much everywhere. So Death's Red Tape is not a typical title, so you'll find it right away.
Awesome. Well, for those of you who are listening, this subject that we spent a lot of time on can be awkward. It can be uncomfortable, but hopefully you got some perspective on how to handle those conversations, different planning that a lot of times is outside of the scope of what you do, but things to be able to share with your client to ensure that they're set up for success moving forward, given the circumstance that they find themselves in. The book will help. Some of this information, of course, will help as well. So this is an episode that's certainly worth sharing. It's a topic that I don't think is talked about enough. And I think that even if you haven't dealt with this scenario before, it's better to learn about it in advance for when inevitably will happen at some point throughout your career. So I'd encourage you to, maybe go back through, take some notes, grab the book and share it with someone that you think would find it valuable as well. And if you would be so kind, so, we found out a few months ago, I mentioned this on a handful of podcasts so far, we're ranked in the top 2.5% of all podcasts globally, which is all thanks to our fantastic guests like Mark today, as well as everyone's advocacy in sharing and reviewing and things like that. And one thing I wanted to do as an ask is if you would be so kind as to leave a review on iTunes for our podcast. My understanding is that you leave that review, you click submit. It doesn't post right away. So once it actually posts, if you just screenshot that and email it to me at david@modelfa.com, and in the subject line, just put Mark Colgan, Colgan. So I know what episode it's in reference to. So if you go ahead and do that, I will correspond with you via email, get your information, and I will buy you a copy of his book. That way you have that on your desk ready to go. So thank you in advance for taking that step. And Mark, I appreciate you going back in the memory bank for some funny stuff, some trying stuff. And I've really enjoyed not just this podcast, but it's been an absolute pleasure working with you up through this point. So I appreciate your time today, your information, your perspective, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, David. You too. It's been a pleasure.